Chairman. This is a great discussion, and if I didn't have an appointment at 12 o'clock, I would prolong it. But I wanted to maybe inject an aspect to this discussion which I have not heard yet. We keep talking about the economy in general. But you know what? We keep talking about taxes in general, but the reality of life in the real world is somewhat different. For example, during the Bush years, median family income for the average American went down by $2,200. 7 million people lost their health insurance. 8 million people dropped out of the middle class and went into poverty. So while the middle class is shrinking and poverty is increasing, in this general abstract world that you're talking about, not everybody has been hurting. Because during the Bush years, among other things, the people on top did very, very well. I think the top 400 wealthiest people in this family saw a doubling of their income. We now have a situation where the top 1% earn more income than the bottom 50%. And in terms of wealth, we have the most unequal distribution of wealth in the industrialized world. Top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. So we're not talking, and we talk about tax reform. Does anybody in their right mind think that you're going to have equitable tax reform here in Washington, where we're going to be descended by all kinds of lobbyists representing the wealthiest people, and loopholes are going to put in? It ain't going to happen. The rich and wealthy and large corporations have enormous influence over this institution as a result of the Supreme Court decision of Citizens United. They're going to get more of their friends to be here represent. That's the real world. Sorry to, bring forth some reality here. So now what we're talking about is we all acknowledge the economy is in terrible shape. We know that. But we all acknowledge that we have a very large national debt, $13 trillion, an unsustainable situation, $1.3 trillion deficit. But I would hope we can hear some discussion that as we move forward, we don't see pain brought all about. Why should working class people who have already experienced pain be asked to experience more pain? Should we really raise the Social Security age to 70 for those people? Should we do, as I gather some want to do this week, cut back on food stamps when we have millions of families who are struggling to keep, to provide food for their kids? Let me suggest to you, as someone who believes the deficit is a serious problem, but also thinks that we have got to create jobs that our economy desperately needs. The American Society of Civil Engineers tells us that we have a $2.2 trillion need for investment in infrastructure in the next 5 years alone. I'm a former mayor. Let me tell you something. The infrastructure doesn't get better, right, unless you invest in it. Why are we not investing in it and putting people to work doing that? On the other hand, I do understand you can't spend. You got a deficit problem. But let me give you some situations here that I think we can address. About $100 billion a year, and the chairman of this committee has made this point many, many times, are avoided in taxes by large corporations and the wealthy by going to tax havens in the Cayman Islands. How many corporations existed in that one building, Mr. Chairman?
18,000.
A little bit crowded. It was hard to do their work, but with 18,000 corporations in one building. Now, it would seem to me if you can get
it was 5 stories.
Oh, okay. Then that was no problem. But it would seem to me if, in the estimate, I think, Mr. Chairman, was something like $100 billion avoidance in taxes. So why aren't we beginning in a serious way to talk about that? In 2005, 1 in 4 large corporations paid no taxes at all. This year, ExxonMobil last year had a bad year. They only made $19 billion in taxes, $19 billion in profits. You know how much they paid in taxes this year? 0. They got a $156 million refund from the IRS. That's the tax system that the IRS and big money has helped create. So my question to you is, shouldn't we be focusing on creating jobs in infrastructure, stopping the absurdity of importing $350 billion a year of foreign oil, move toward energy independence, and at the same time go forward with deficit reduction in a fair and progressive way, which doesn't hurt middle-class and working-class families? Dr. Johnson, why don't you start it, and I'd like to hear from the others.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, of course, we can put more money into infrastructure, and I supported the committee in that discussion over a year ago. It's not that easy. given the way that our spending is set up. But that certainly is a sensible proposition. And in terms of tax reform, I think what's particularly interesting and intriguing about the value-added tax is that this idea is coming from people to the right of the political spectrum, like Professor Mankiw, as well as some people on the left, and how progressive or regressive your VAT system is, we can see from the experience of other countries, depends on how you design it, what exactly you're taxing, what are you zero rating. It's a relatively hard tax to avoid. It's a tax that focuses on consumption rather than on income, which has sensible effects on incentives. And I think I'm somewhat encouraged that people are moving at the technical level in the direction of thinking hard about those kinds of proposals. Obviously, it's a political decision how regressive it will be, and I'm rather on your side in thinking that the vested interests, once they get their hands on it, will distort it. I do think in all of the issues that you raise, one thing that we must not avoid is Medicare. So Medicare is, if you look out 30-year, 40-year horizon, that's a huge issue. And how do we address Medicare, for example, by basing it on lifetime earnings, how your access to Medicare?
Medicare is part of our healthcare system. And as you well know, we end up spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other major country on earth. And our outcomes in some cases are not as good. So I don't think it's just a question of Medicare. It's a question of a healthcare system geared toward profit, in which people are making all kinds of money out of it and not necessarily providing quality care.
Well, that's a very good point, Senator, and I'm sure you're right, the healthcare system as a whole needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, it is the case, if you put all the European Union health spending projections on a comparable basis to what the CBO uses, the IMF has done this, but it's not that widely known, their numbers are just as bad as ours in terms of containing future healthcare spending. So whatever all the systems across the industrialized world have a very similar problem, which is the demographics and
aging population.
The aging population and the increasing cost of medical technologies. And so the question is, to what extent do you give people access to those technologies later in life?
But here, we're getting back to the basic point. I mean, that's a reality. It's going to be a reality in Europe, a reality in the United States. People are getting older. Healthcare becomes more expensive. We want the most cost-effective, best system we can. But I don't think, in the midst of all of this, the point that I'm making is we got a whole lot of problems. Some of my good friends will end up concluding that the way you solve these problems is punishing working class people, low-income people, middle-class people. That will ultimately be their solution. I think when you have a society which is moving in many ways toward oligarchy, where I thought I heard a laughter. Well, some of them sitting right in this room. Some of them who think it's funny when we talk about oligarchy when the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%, and we see that trend growing even wider. That's what I would call oligarchy. But be that as it may, I think the key debate, I think Senator Conrad earlier, I was watching on TV, raised the issue. We got a huge debt, we got to deal with it. We got a huge financial crisis, we got to deal with it. How do you deal with it? Well, I would suggest that everything being equal, unless we rally the American people, working class, low income, middle class people, it will be dealt with. It'll be dealt with by making the poorest people poorer. It'll be dealt with by seeing the middle class decline even more. It will be dealt with by seeing the gap between the very rich and everybody else grow wider. I think we could do better.